We will start now, and everybody can join when they are joining. We'll start. First of all, would like to welcome and thank Prof. Laro to accept our invitation for this talk. We really appreciate him, and we are really happy to have him with us. So, before we start, just a brief introduction. So, my name is Dr. Abdulhamid Al Hazmi. I'm an endocrinologist. I'm currently obesity fellow in St. Vincent University Hospital. And we would like again to welcome in the name of the Saudi Society Doctors in Ireland, Prof. Carl Laroux for this talk. Brief introduction to Prof. Laroux, as we can, I believe everybody is already has read his CV, his extraordinary CV. We can call Prof. Laroux as we know, a prodigy actually in multiple levels, not only in field of medicine. So Prof. Laro is currently a consultant metabolic medicine and chemical pathologist. He graduated from South Africa and his SBR in metabolic medicine in Hammerhesh Hospital and his PhD from Imperial College. Uh, and he is currently served as a chemical pathology and metabolic medicine chair. So Prof. Laro, during his fascinating career, he had won multiple awards, multiple time President of Ireland Young Researcher Award, he also Clinician Scientist Award from the National Institution of Health Research in the UK and Wellcome Trust Clinical Research Fellowship. So Prof. Laro as well, he's currently he's currently the chair of the Sophia project, which funded for obesity across the EU with multi-million euros. And I believe not a lot of people knows about that, but Prof. Laro is actually as well an Olympic champion. He went as a South African shot putter. I don't know what happened, Prof. Laro, but I think medicine talks, medicine talk this hobbies and this gives away. I'm not sure. The stage is yours. And before anything else, the most important thing as well, I'm proud to be his current fellow as well. Please, Prof. Laro, the stage is yours.
That's very kind. And now let me just double check. You can hear me okay and you can see the slides okay?
Yeah, we can see it clearly, Prof.
Perfect, perfect. Well, listen, it's a wonderful opportunity, and I'm really very grateful for this invitation. And I've also been incredibly fortunate to work with so many fantastic fellows from KSA, and just also thanking to them. But this question that you asked about integrating clinical duties with research in Ireland, I want to start with this famous painting that hangs in the London Gallery of Copernicus. And you will remember at the time, the really smart people in the world at least understood that the earth was round. But what they saw is every day the sun came up in the east and the sun went around, and every day the sun set in the west. So their observation was that the earth must be the center of the universe, and the sun is in fact rotating around the earth. And of course, Copernicus came with his science and said, actually, it's 180 degrees wrong. It turns out that the earth rotates around the sun. So this was different to the lived experience of people, but because it was better science, we were able to interpret the natural world much better. So what I'm also saying with this, I would like you to think about this, is there's so many things that we do in our clinical duties, and we're just doing it over and over again. But I want you to actually use that and think about your clinical duties, especially about how you can use that to reinterpret the world that we live in and to make sense. So I work with lots of different companies. I work with nutrition companies, with pharmaceutical companies, with surgical companies, because we do not think obesity is one disease. But we also have a philosophy, that we are generating both our clinical duties as well as our research. And part of that is we think about obesity as a disease, and we are trying to differentiate two different treatments. One that we call weight loss treatments, and that's effectively calorie restriction if you ask somebody to eat less and move more. And we also think about something completely different, which is treatments for the disease of obesity. And this is our Greek character called Sisyphus, he was thrown into the depths of Hades, of hell. And what he had to do is roll this rock up this hill every day. And every day he got to the top of the hill, the rock would roll down. And that's how I think, as my clinical duties was in the past, when I asked patients to eat less and move more. That was like helping Sisyphus up this hill. But what I'm doing now, because of our research insights, I've changed my clinical duties. And instead of helping and supporting Sisyphus to roll this rock up, all I'm doing now is I'm removing the rock. Okay. So philosophically, we are doing the same thing. We are helping the patient, but there's two different ways to help the patient, and that's what research allowed us to do. And of course, if the data changes, we can change our mind. So I think that's the evidence of where we are. So when we're thinking about obesity, we think of it as a disease, and of course, diseases have symptoms, they have signs, and they have complications. And what I'm showing you here is the more than 220 complications of the disease of obesity. And that was very much the focus of our work in the past, was about the complications and how can we reduce the complications. And you can see a lot of the questions that we generated came from this place where we really focused on the complications of the disease of obesity. We are now not focused on the signs of the disease. The signs is the amount of adipocyte mass, but we're actually focusing on the complications, but now also more and more on the food, on the symptoms, which patients very often tell us about food noise. So it shows the evolution, and I think that's an important thing. Wherever you start from, you always need to move forward and think about, what are you learning from patients, from your clinical duties, and how can you apply it in a research context. So I had an old boss that always said to me, the truth is in the patients. You just have to ask them. And I think that's something that we sometimes underestimate, is just how much information we have there. And we've been part of big guideline writing committees. This is on the left, it's the European Association for Study of Obesity. On the right, it's the Lancet Commission. And it's also fair to say that we have to remain humble, in our clinical duties as well as in our research, because there's so much more that we can learn. So I very often say, and Dr. Dulomit will know this, is, every day is a school day. So every day you come to clinic, every day you come to hospital, you have to exit having learned something. And it doesn't matter how senior you are or how old you are, you always need to come and, try to learn something. And that's a good way to do it. So let me show you what we did maybe 15 years ago. Is we wanted to go beyond body mass index. So we wanted to create a staging score that allows us not to think about obesity in how heavy somebody is, but to think about obesity in how sick somebody is. So we call this Beyond BMI. So this was an obesity staging score that we generated. And so that I can remember it in clinic, it goes alphabetical. So A for airway, B for BMI, C for cardiovascular disease, D for diabetes, economic, functional, gonadal, health status perceived, which is quality of life, image, which is what patients see when they look in the mirror, junction of the gastroesophagus, kidney, liver, medication, and neurology. And what we did is stage 0 is if somebody has, there's no impact on those systems. Stage 1 is people at risk of a disease. Stage 2 is people with established disease. And stage 3 is people with complicated disease. So let me use diabetes as an example. So stage 0 is normal glycemia. Stage 2 is pre-diabetes, impaired fasting glycemia or impaired glucose tolerance. Stage 2 is controlled diabetes, and stage 3 is uncontrolled diabetes or diabetes with complications with microvascular disease or macrovascular disease. So what I want to do when I treat obesity is I don't care about the weight loss, but what I care about, a little bit what we learned with cancer, is I want to downstage the disease. So I want to take somebody with obesity, for example, that has uncontrolled diabetes, and I want to give them a nutritional therapy to control their diabetes. Or I want to take somebody with uncontrolled diabetes and give them a medication and turn them into somebody with impaired fasting glycemia or pre-diabetes. Or I want to take them with somebody with uncontrolled diabetes, give them bariatric surgery, and turn them into somebody with normoglycemia. So what I want to do is I want to measure my success not in weight loss, but I want to measure the success in health gain. And I think that applies to all of medicine. Ultimately, you have to work out what is it that you are doing, and are you just reducing the signs of the disease? Are you just reducing the complications of the disease? What's the value to the patient? What's the value proposition? And ultimately, we think it's the health gain, both for us, but also for the payers and also for the patients. If we can articulate health gain, I think we're going to be better. So let me use a classical patient. This is Mrs. J.K. She's a 65-year-old retired business lady. She had a myocardial infarction 3 years ago. She's recently been diagnosed with prediabetes. She has a body mass index of 36. She's had an intensive diet and exercise approach. She lost 5 kilograms, but then she regained it over 6 months. She is, and if we ask her, what are you concerned about? She says, I'm concerned about developing heart disease, diabetes, inflammatory arthritis, and this is causing me a deterioration in my health and especially during my retirement. So this is a quick case. So let me summarize her using our King's Obesity Staging Score. So airway, no sleep apnea, so she's stage 0, BMI 36, so stage 2, cardiovascular disease, previous myocardial infarction, hypertension, dyslipidemia, she's stage 2, diabetes, prediabetes, stage 1, economics, she's retired, business lady, stage 0, functional. She can only manage one flight of stairs before she has pain in both her knees. So now, that would be stage 2. Gonadal, postmenopausal, stage 0. Health status perceived. She's concerned about her deteriorating health. Okay, so that would be stage 1. Image, she avoids mirrors. She doesn't like what she sees in the mirror. That's stage 1. Junction of the gastroesophagus, no problem, stage 0. Kidney, no problem, stage 0. Liver, she has MASH. So that would be stage 2. So what we immediately have is we're not thinking about this lady as somebody with a BMI of 36. We're now thinking about this patient, with either mechanical complications, metabolic complications, or mental complications. And immediately we are going beyond our BMI. So this is sort of clinical duty. So this is what we do every day, and this is how we stage patients. And when they come back, after they've had treatment, nutritional therapies, pharmacotherapies, or surgical therapies, we can then restage them. And it's in this process of restaging them that we learned so many new things. And I think that is an opportunity. So the question is, on the health status, this patient says, do you think of yourself as healthy or unhealthy? Or let me say, I ask all the patients in clinic, I ask them a standard question. Do you think of yourself as healthy or unhealthy? And about 8 out of 10 people will say, I'm unhealthy. And then I would say, why are you unhealthy? And they would say, oh, because I'm fat. I said, if I give you a backpack, I put 2 big rocks inside your backpack, I'll make you heavy, but I won't make you unhealthy. Why do you think you're unhealthy? And what the patient tells me next is the most important part of my clinical assessment. And this is again coming back to that saying, it's like the truth is in the patient. You just need to ask them. And in this case, I said to the patient, do you think of yourself as healthy or unhealthy? And she said, no, I'm unhealthy because I'm worried about my deteriorating health. Okay. But that's interesting, but it's not specific enough. Okay. So let me ask the patient, what about the deteriorating health are you worried about? So remember, this is a 36 BMI patient with heart attacks, with prediabetes, with MASH, but what is the thing that really worries her about the deteriorating health? And its functionality. She says, no, I can't walk up a flight of stairs without having pain. I can't enjoy my retirement. I'm worried that I won't be mobile enough. Okay. So immediately what I have is I have the health gain that I need to pursue. So when I'm going to treat this patient, yes, I'm going to reduce the weight. Yes, I'm going to reduce the risk of heart attacks. Yes, I'm going to reduce the risk of diabetes. Yes, I'm going to improve MASH. I'm going to do all these things. But if I don't address this patient's clinical need, then I am not going to be a good doctor. This patient's not going to be adherent to the treatment. There's lots of challenges. So this is a clinical case, and now I'm going to show you how we've used, different aspects within this clinical case to just ask questions. And those questions have been the basis of much of the research that many of our clinical fellows from Saudi Arabia and others have actually done. And I'm going to show you just some of the work. And so everything I've shown you now is like, you guys do this every day. None of this is special. None of this is magic. None of this needs particular intellect. But what happens next, I think, is your opportunity, while you're doing your fellowship here, is like, what are you going to get from this? This is your ability to think and to be a little bit free, of, all the obligations that you have at home, when you're back in Saudi. But your time here is really precious because you have time to think. And that's what I would like to encourage you guys to do. So let me show you how we've done that. So what we did is we said, okay, this is a simple case, but let me generate some questions from this. So first of all, what do patients value the most after they've had treatment? I've shown you what is their biggest fear before treatment, but what are the things that really they value most from health gain? Secondly, why do we see more females than males in our obesity clinic? And all of us would have some ideas, but is it true? And is it also true for clinical trials? Because most of our data is generated from the patients that we come to clinic, so this is not a gender balance. Secondly, how good am I, when I work in clinic versus the best clinical trial outcome? So we run a clinical trials outfit, and Dr. Abdulhamid is very involved with that, running a lot of the clinical trials, learning about clinical trials. But am I better in my clinical trials, or am I better in my clinical practice? And then why do patients not stay on medications, right? So in the clinical trials, we can keep people in because we have a lot of resources, but in clinical practice, how good are we at keeping people on treatments, and why do they stop? Then something that we noticed, and it was an observation, people came back and they said, I drink less alcohol now. I still like alcohol, I still like the taste of it, but I'm just not bothered. I'm not drinking so much. Is that true? Okay. And then can we identify the patients who come to us who have common genetic abnormalities? Because we know obesity is a disease, we know it has a strong genetic factors, but can we identify, do I need a genetic test, or can I just look at patients and say, okay, you've got a genetic abnormality, you don't. How good am I? Because I've seen thousands of patients, right? And then finally, what can we do with medications before and after medicine? Or rather, what can we do with medication before and after bariatric surgery? So here's some data that was generated by three of the fellows that we've had, Muath, Khalid, as well as Heshma. And what we basically asked is, what do patients value most after treatment? And we used the King's Obesity Staging Score, remember, from airway, BMI, cardiovascular, and we just generated a questionnaire, and they sat in clinic, and 1 year after people have lost 25% of their weight, they simply asked the patients, what was the most important thing to you? And list this from number 1 to number 13. And of course, the thing you list as number 1 has the lowest score. So this is a little bit, if you guys have ever done sailing, the people who win a sailing competition is the one with the lowest score, because every time you participate, you either, if you're number 1, for 3 races, you get 1, 1, 1. That counts up to 3. So let's see. And it turns out, when we ask patients, 1 year after they've lost 25% of their weight, what's the most important thing to them? You could see, I became more active and I could do more things. So that same thing that the patient said, was concerning to her, that was the most important thing when we asked 114 of our patients, what was the most important thing? The second thing was, I'm less worried about developing heart disease. Right, that was the third thing. The next one was also about functionality. I can fit into my clothes easier. And then my diabetes improved, or my risk of diabetes reduced. So you could see the value to patients was not, what do I see when I look in the mirror? Okay. The value, that was much lower down, somewhere in the middle here. The value was that metabolic gains, that was the functional gains, that was really the critical thing to the patient. So that's very important, because now when we communicate this research, we can say to other doctors that start treating, listen, don't focus on the weight loss. That's not important to patients. Focus on the health gain, focus on the functional gain, focus on the metabolic gain. So this was a great piece of work. And it's also interesting because this piece of work spanned different fellowships. So it was one fellow started it, and then the second fellow took it over and then worked together. So it was also how the fellows were able to work together. So don't be too worried about something that you have to start and you have to finish, but also work with your supervisors and say, there's another fellow coming after me. Can we work together, on a project that may take a little bit more time? So the second question is, why do we see more females than males? And here we had Dr. Muirth again going back and actually looking at all the randomized controlled trials ever published in the literature. And what he saw is that if you look at the bottom, the proportion of females were much, much higher than the proportion of males when we looked at if we looked at the randomized controlled trials published since 1998 until 2025. But we looked at the body mass index, it was around 35, so very similar to what we saw in clinic. So we made a simple observation, and this was published in the Lancet, right? So it was a throwaway comment, like, why do we see more males or females? Is this the same in clinical trials? And when we went back, we were able to publish this in the Lancet. So that actually shows you just how a good question can generate a really good paper. So then we asked the question, how good are we when we work in clinic, right? And are we as good as our in the real world, are we as good as clinical trials? And what we were able to do is publish the first data in Ireland, where we used a medication called semaglutide, again driven by two of the fellows, Khalid and Muirth. And here we worked with primary care, because Khalid was a primary care physician. Muirth was an endocrinologist, but we were able to work with the primary care colleagues. And this is, I think, a very important lesson that I would suggest to all of you, is that sometimes you can come up with very, very good questions, very good research questions, very interesting. But if you don't have the data in your hand, if you have to work with other people and they can't get you the data, then you are dead, right, when it comes to research. So what we were able to do here is we worked with the primary care setting, but we went to them. We sat on their computers and we extracted the information. We didn't ask them send us the information. We went and sat on their computers and extracted the data. And that's important because it gives you access to information. So the minute you have to ask somebody else to help you, it becomes more difficult. So a critical lesson here is you must have the data in your hand. So generate questions that you have data that you can then you can progress on. But when we actually looked at at those patients that we treated, we were very good. We got exactly the same amount of weight loss. But this is Dr. Faisal that was most recently with us as a fellow. He then went back into the data set and saw, how good were we at retaining patients. And it turned out we were equally rubbish than everybody else. Everybody in the world, the big data sets were all showing 50% of people stopped the drugs within 1 or 2 years. And that's exactly what we found. When we went back and saw how many patients did we have at 1 year, at 2 years, at 3 years, we also saw that we lost almost half of our patients over 3 years. But what was interesting here is what Dr. Faisal was able to do is he was able to go back to the patients because we had the information. So we could go back to the patients, and because this was registered as a clinical audit, not as clinical research. Because remember, an audit is if you know what the answer is and you're measuring yourself against the gold standard. Research is if you don't know what the answer is and you want to discover something. So here we said, the standard, the gold standard is that we need to retain 100% of patients because that's effectively what we can do in clinical trials. Are we meeting that standard? And it turned out, no, we were very much below the standard. So benchmarking, we were very much below the benchmark. But because it's just a clinical audit, we could work with the patients and we could go back to them and say, why did you stop? And that's when we learned. We said 36% of patients stopped because of side effects, 24% stopped because they didn't really understand that obesity was a disease. They didn't really buy into treating obesity as a disease. 23% stopped because of the cost, 11% stopped because the medication wasn't available, 7% stopped because of non-response. Now what I'm doing is I'm merely asking a clinical question, which is, which of those can I change? So I can't change the cost of the drug, I can't change the availability of the drug, and I can't change whether or not somebody is going to respond or not respond. But what I can do is I can reduce the side effects. I can improve the understanding of the disease of obesity. So this is a good example how we are in clinic. So I'll speed up a little bit. But so what I was saying is that so what I've done here is I've been able to learn, and now I can work on how can I reduce the side effects, how can I reduce the understanding, or how can I improve the understanding of the disease of obesity. So that's a really good example of how what Dr. Faisal did is improving my clinical practice because I can now work better. One of the observations that we had initially, and this was really just completely throwaway observation, patients would start saying, I drink less alcohol, and then we heard it again, and then we heard it again. And then we were able to work with Dr. Maurice O'Farrell in the inner city of Dublin, and he was very, very good at collecting information on alcohol in his patients as part of his clinical assessment. And Dr. Faisal, again, that's a family practitioner, was able to work with Dr. O'Farrell and actually write the paper. So that's another thing that you have. Remember, you have time, and very often you can actually tell people, listen, I can help you write, I can help submit the papers, I can work with you, I can do all the unpleasant or not so exciting work, but I get a paper, right? And Dr. Faisal learned so much from this process, and he was so instrumental in running the analysis and working with Dr. Maurice O'Farrell. So I think this paper was published in Diabetes, Obesity and Metabolism, a high-ranking journal, and it was the first time that this observation was published. So we were the first in the world to actually show this prospectively. And again, since then, many other people have followed and have shown. So this is also important. If you are fast, I always say nobody remembers who came second. So if you make an observation in clinic, pursue it, and get it written up. Because if you take 2 or 3 years, nobody's going to remember if your paper is, 10th. But this was the first paper in the space, so I thought this was very good. Then we had this argument, we had a discussion in clinic, and again, you can see Dr. Khalid, as Dr. Muath as well here, some of the fellows together with the other members of our team. We ran a genetic study, and we did genetic analysis on a large number of patients. And then and then we started getting the results back. And I said to Khalid and Muath, I said to him, would you be able to tell these people apart, these people with genetic abnormalities and people without? And they said, they don't know if we are good enough to tell them apart, because they were shocked at which patients we could find and which patients we could not find genetic abnormalities. So it was a very simple question: how good are we? And then we actually were able to go back and look at our data again, audited, look at the patients, the heaviest lifetime, those with negative results, with positive genetic results. You can see absolutely no difference. Those with the heaviest lifetime weight, negative, positive, no difference there. Age of hyperphagia, again, no difference. So a family history, no difference. So effectively what we're able to teach ourselves is that we have to remain humble. We are good clinicians. We have seen, tens of thousands, if not more, patients with obesity. This is all we do. We are really good at this, right? But we are no better than flipping a coin when it comes to predicting things, like predicting genetic abnormalities or predicting the response. And I think that's also important is sometimes you have to do the research, and even if you don't like the answer, because the answer would have been nice if it was like we are very clever and we are very good, but it's okay to find the answer that you don't like, and that's important. Is whenever you do research, don't give people the answer that you think they want to have. Give them the truth. Okay, because with the truth we can work, right? But if you tell me stuff that you think I want to know, then I'm not making progress, right? So that's another important bit about research. And this is where we are now. So one of the things that we've done is, and that was when Dr. Khalid was here before, wrote a review article on, pharmacotherapy before and after bariatric surgery. And this is a real evolution now that we are thinking about treatment targets. And this is something I think we're going to do more, combining medications with surgery. So this is, something that Dr. Muirth is working on now as well. So that's very interesting. So let me summarize and say, obesity is not a moral failure. This is a very famous painting of Dante's Inferno, painted by Botticelli. And European thinking was very much driven by these concepts of the seven mortal sins. And two of the mortal sins, one is gluttony and the other one is sloth. And of course, a sin is a willful act. And if you think somebody is sinful, then you have to help them to become a better person. But in fact, if we understand that obesity is not a moral failure, obesity is not a sin, it's biology. And all we have to do is just treat it as a biological disease, then we become much better. And that's what a lot of our research has been focused on. So, in conclusion, we think obesity is a complex and chronic set of neurobiological diseases. Okay, it's characterized by excess adipose tissue, but that causes a deterioration in health. That's the World Health Organization definition, and that's how we are thinking about obesity. And treatment should alleviate symptoms, it should reduce complications, and it should provide optimal health gain. And for that reasons, we now think the objective of treatment is not weight loss, but health gain. So our research is focused around that. So using what we do in clinic and asking those questions. So thank you very much. I'm handing back to you. And if there's any questions, I would be delighted to address them. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Laro, for this interesting talk. For me, myself, I learn a lot from you every single time. And now, anyone, please, if anyone has a question, he can ask directly, or he can write, or she or he can write on the chat, please.
Yes, I'm Dr. Ibrahim Yassin. I enjoyed the lecture very much, and new information to learn that GLP-1 can reduce the alcohol consumption, which is really interesting. I have a question. If we have a female in a reproductive age and she had a delivery and during lactation and after lactation, when is the optimal time to restart the GLP-1 medication?
That's a very good question. And we've been using this class of medication for more than 20 years now. So we have a lot of data on this. And of course, these are natural peptides, and they are not metabolized either through the liver or the kidney. They are actually broken down by peptidases. So the peptidases would just cleave the peptide, and but the peptides would live in the system for about a week. That's the half-life. So we haven't tested it in patients either during pregnancy or in patients when they are breastfeeding. The chances of the peptide actually making it into breast milk is pretty small because of the way that it is actually digested by peptidases. However, we do not suggest to anybody to use the medication while breastfeeding. So what we normally would do is we would start the treatments again immediately after somebody has stopped breastfeeding. So that's effectively where we are now. It's becoming more of a problem because we now use these medications pre-pregnancy. So people who have subfertility or patients who have severe obesity that may have complications of pregnancy because of their obesity. So we actually reduce people's body mass index substantially before they fall pregnant. The problem then is the minute they fall pregnant, we stop the medication. And then what happens is you have pregnancy weight gain and you have relapse of the disease of obesity. So you actually have extraordinary weight gain in people who are pregnant who've stopped the medication. And that's what you would expect to happen. So patients become very anxious, and patients actually would like to start the medication as soon as possible. But again, we need to be now. That was actually another question that came up in clinic. It was done not by one of our fellows, but one of our students. And we actually went back to the FDA website where all the data is reported on patients who had unplanned pregnancies during randomized controlled trials. And we were able to see what were the outcomes of the pregnancy in people that were randomized to the placebo arm or people that were randomized to the intervention arm. And it turned out there was no difference. So that's reassuring, but that's not enough data to change our clinical practice. But that's just another example of a question that came up, and we were able to go back and look at the data. So thank you for the question.
If you allow me, Dr. Abdelhamid and Dr. Leroux, thank you so much for this wonderful overview always about obesity, and especially when you talk about research is another area of interest in research in obesity world. My question regarding how do we tackle the best research methodologies when we want to investigate further obesity overall? Because I know lots of questions has been answered already among the world, and maybe they are privileged to have the randomized clinical trials, but some parts of the world that we don't have the same facility. So my question is, would it be okay to do, and I'm just interested to know, because we are, as Arab, we are really different than other population, right? Genetically, we are different. So is it okay to go for the observational studies, retrospective studies, to answer a question probably has been answered from different parts of the world, but just trying to understand how are we getting obesity patients in our lands?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And that data that Dr. Moorth did on the both the sex as well as BMI, we also had ethnicity as part of that. I didn't show the data, but you're absolutely right that Caucasians are very, very highly represented, and all other ethnicities are very poorly represented. And especially people from the Gulf region are underrepresented in randomized trials. As an example, Dr. Heshma, that was one of our fellows, she came and learned how to do clinical trials. And when she went back to Riyadh, she was able to set up a clinical trials unit in obesity. And now we also have randomized controlled trials for obesity in the kingdom, which is something that is pretty new. But Dr. Heshma was able to, we call it transferable skills. She was able to learn something here. And because she had so much experience with clinical trials, she now leads the clinical trial program there. So I think randomized controlled trials will remain the gold standard for many years. But it's very expensive, and it may not be necessary. So I think prospective studies, but also what people refer to as retrospective studies, can add value. So real world evidence is becoming much, much more important. And that's why when you do collect data, in clinical practice, make sure that you can audit the data. So in Ireland and the UK, we talk about clinical audit. Where you can go back to data that's been collected. But if the same data was collected in a prospective manner, the data is very secure. A good example of that was Dr. Maurice O'Farrell, who was prospectively always collected data about alcohol intake. He had an interest in this. This was his clinical interest, so he always collected it. So when we generated the question, we could go back and audit it. It wasn't retrospective because the data was prospectively collected in the same way. So it was an audit of prospective data. So those are words that we use, but it has important concepts. But one of the things that you were talking about, the research methodologies. One of the methodologies that we are using more and more is what's called qualitative research. So everything I showed you now is quantitative research. Quantitation is like we put a number, we do statistics. But qualitative research is also becoming very important, and that's effectively hearing the narratives or hearing the stories from the patients, collecting it in a very rigorous scientific way, and then thematically analyzing it to allow us to generate new hypotheses. And that comes back to this question about, or the comment about the truth is in the patients. You just have to ask them. So I think, when it comes to obesity, what we are learning now, so for example, I referred to this concept, and Dr. Abdulhamid is working on this about food noise. And we say food noise wasn't an academic concept. It wasn't, doctors that came up with this idea. It was patients that shouted this at us and said, this food noise has suddenly disappeared in my head since I've had the treatment. And now we're trying to understand it using qualitative research. So let me summarize that and say, use the methodologies that you have available to you. Don't try to, like, perfection can be the enemy of the good. If you don't have randomized trials, then that's okay. Then do the best you can, but also know there is a hierarchy of, so don't pretend that real world evidence is the same value as randomized trials. But if real world evidence is all you have access to, then do that the best that you can. That was a very long answer, but I hope I addressed some of the questions.
Thank you so much. You've answered exactly my question. Thank you.
Any other questions? So I believe by that we can conclude our session. We would like from the Saudi Society of Doctors in Ireland to thank and appreciate Prof. Laroux's time and his very informative lectures. And it was really our pleasure to host him here. Dr. Sajja?
Yeah, thank you, Doctor, for organizing that, and thank you for Dr. Laroux. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for the kindness of the invitation. And I really wish you all the best. And I also wanted to thank you all for choosing to come to Ireland and working in Ireland, because what you are doing is you are really helping, our patients. You're really helping our system. You're really enriching us, when we work here. So thank you to you for choosing Ireland as well.
Thank you.
Bye bye.